Okay. And of course, these things will have to feed back into the utility function to give us the equilibrium, so that all those have to be consistent. And here, the mu j's are the weights of the individual departments. We don't do very much with it, but formally, it does define the general equilibrium for us. Okay, so we use a closed form. The closed form is not completely innocuous. So for example, well, the utility function, the natural line function are fairly natural, but of course this could have been nonlinear. That function has the right kinds of convexity properties that we need, and that is important. And subject to having the convexity properties, the particular form makes it easier for us to deal with it. Okay. So the individual official chooses a psi, which is equal to that. The B is his maximum corruption opportunity. The Z is a scaling factor that aligns his moral cost with his income opportunity. Okay. So the higher his opportunities are, the more corrupt he chooses to be. The higher his moral cost is, the less corrupt he will choose to be, given a natural stance. Okay, the average organization-wide corruption is determined, is actually, yeah, okay, is determined. I'm going to drop the subscripts on the B's now because it doesn't help very much. Now this, what we need to solve for is actually the phi hat, the natural line for each department. And of course, if we have different departments coordinating on different equilibria, oh, I could have used this better. Different equilibria, that would mean that these phi hats would have to be different for different equilibria. Okay. So because we have the convexity properties, we get, in the simplest model, we get one where there are two possible moral lines. So some departments could coordinate on one. So that's what the picture looks like. Our quadratic, I've broken up. That's the main equation that defines the solution of phi hats for a given phi. I've broken it up into two curves. So there are two possible equilibria, phi hat L and phi hat H. Now it turns out that phi hat L is stable, but phi hat H is not stable, which means that departments will coordinate either on phi hat L or on 1. Okay. Either they will be completely corrupt or they will be somewhat corrupt. Now, what happens with that diagram is the following. Suppose the economy-wide, so I've got this and that. Suppose the economy-wide level of corruption falls, then this curve shifts up because the intercept here is linear in phi. Oh. Okay. And if the corruption opportunities increase, then the curve shifts up. If the moral costs decrease, the curve shifts up. Now you can have a situation in which I'm actually pretty close to, what is this? You can have a situation where this curve lies entirely above the line, in which case everybody becomes completely corrupt. And the most important thing is that in the same economy, depending on how corrupt, how individual departments coordinate, you could have an equilibrium in which everybody is corrupt, fully corrupt. You could have an equilibrium in which some people are not very corrupt and others are very corrupt. And you could have an equilibrium where this is 1, you can't go beyond 1. You could have an equilibrium in which everybody is completely not corrupt, and I've lost track of my diagram now. And the 1 is no longer an equilibrium. Okay? So with the same fundamentals, with the same B's, which is the corruption opportunities, and the same moral costs, you can get coordination equilibria in which everybody is fully corrupt. You can get coordination equilibria in which departments coordinate on different equilibria, and you could get an equilibrium in which no department is corrupt at all. Okay. And you can think of clear policy measures using which you could move economies from the very bad equilibria to the much better equilibria. Let me just see if... what would happen if we let departments coordinate entirely based on what they see within the department? If nobody saw what's happening outside in the economy, it turns out everybody coordinates in the same equilibrium, which is the low one. Had a question? And there are various inevitable comparative static results. What happens if B changes and Z changes and so on. I'm not going to bore you with them.
So this paper was motivated from my own observations during this long, drawn-out process of the Indian elections, at a time when there was a huge debate about whether exit polls or opinion polls really that was conducted mid-elections would affect sort of the decisions of late voters. And there wasn't really much evidence that sort of was backing some of the sort of policy debates that were going on. And so the basic question that I was really interested in asking in this paper is really whether exit polls affect the voting behavior of later round voters. And I want to sort of put structure on this question and then try and see whether, if that does hold true, and if there is a result of an exit poll on voting behavior, whether that can be explained due to some part of observational learning on behalf of voters, or is it some preference for conformity that that voters sort of exhibit. And I'm going to try and sort of sell the observational learning story to be dominant in this case. So just to start with some definitions, an exit poll is generally considered to be a poll of voters as they leave the polling and voting booth with, usually taken by the news media in order to predict the outcome of an election. There's been a lot of literature on, not particularly exit polls, but really on sort of this, on how voter behavior in sequential versus simultaneous elections, looking at efficiency and equity and welfare implications. There's a social learning literature which looks at how, when agents are in a sequence, when they receive noisy signals, how they can make their choices based on these signals. There are papers, Rebecca's of course at the forefront of this literature, that have looked at, when there is payoff interdependence, how later round voters in a sequential setup can infer and learn from the outcomes of early phases, which can act as signals. There's evidence, experimental evidence in laboratory settings which show that indeed later or agents that make choices in subsequent and later rounds do infer something from outcomes which are released from sort of agents that have made choices before. This is particularly the case for US primaries, which are sequenced. where actual voting returns are released after every primary is finished. So there's a paper by Knight and Schiff that look at momentum effects in the context of the US primaries, and they find significant momentum effects, which is that candidates in the US primaries that have gained early poll substantial leads tend to do relatively better in the later rounds. And the idea there for the Knight and Schiff paper, I mean, the way that they sort of identify this effect is to sort of track the evolution of the common prior over the sort of rounds of the US primaries. There's limited literature on exit polls, coming mainly from sort of qualitative surveys, where voters are asked whether or not they've responded and they're aware of exit polls and whether, for example, it's affected their turnout, the probability that they will go out to vote. And the reason why it's hard in a way to try and kind of quantify this effect of exit polls is because in most countries exit polls are severely restricted. Although, you know, this debate about exit polls is now again, you know, coming up to because there's, with sort of multiple channels of communication, especially through the internet, a lot of laws that were sort of constructed, sort of imposing a gag on print media is no longer applicable, for example, to the internet media. So there is still continuing debate in this. In the countries where exit poll restrictions do not apply but then are debated, there is some potential, and that's what I'm going to try and do in the paper, to try and see whether there is an effect, because polling in these countries varies by state and by time zone. And one can then exploit this variation to try and see whether or not there's an effect. And I think there is this, the idea to try and see, to answer this question is really, because the policy debate is about whether or not to allow these mid-election release of information, primarily because it does call into question the order of voting, because early voters then exert a disproportionate influence on the outcome of the general election. And it could potentially give an unfair advantage to winners if there's a sort of bandwagon effect or there's a preference for conformity. So there's a specific policy question that one needs to be able to look at. So I'm going to try and examine this question in sort of the Indian general election setting, where elections are held on average over a month, a period of 1 month. And there's multi-phase polling, so it's different constituencies go to poll on different dates, decided by the Election Commission, yeah. It could be because of the bandwagon effect, or it could be because of the learning effect, in which case later voters can infer something from how earlier voters have voted. So the idea is that if any shocks, for example, to that affect the decisions of earlier voters will then sort of dissipate onto the later voters. So do you accept? No, the front. Yes, the front's actually. So they have. So it's a round, right? So after you vote, is that the question? After you vote, and then the elections come out in the second round.
No, you can choose to go in the morning, and then you're likely to be polled, and you affect the later voters. In the US, if you're in the East, you have to vote first, and in the West, you would be last. Right?
Yeah. So let me just come to the context, and I'll sort of. So I guess even in the US, people in the East can decide whether they want to go in the morning or in the night, or in their day. But you're right in that they're restricted depending on the date, I suppose, or the time zone. So that's something that's the identification source here in effect. Polling is usually conducted in 4 to 5 different phases, and they're approximately set to cover an interval of about 1 week. So I'm going to try and empirically identify this effect of observational learning using the 2004 general elections, primarily because this was the one election where exit poll broadcasting was completely unrestricted. So this is just to sort of make more clear sort of the structure of the model of the measurements. I'm just going to try and talk about the context. So that's the country divided into states, and each state, the states themselves are divided into constituencies. So the way that polling would have worked in 2004 was that a set of constituencies went to poll in the first phase, so that's the second phase, third phase, and that's the final phase. And the idea is to... Sorry?
How is it?
Yeah, so the phases are determined by the Election Commission of India, which is an autonomous organization. So they consider a lot of factors like rainfall and sort of the occurrence of holidays, and primarily the mobilization of social security forces that can man polling booths. So selection is endogenous. So the idea, and that's why sort of I'm highlighting these boundaries within state sort of polling phase variations that do take place. So the idea is to kind of use these boundaries as in a regression discontinuity framework and sort of look at the effect of voters on either side of the boundary, but ones who polled before, comparing the outcomes of ones who polled before to the ones who polled later.
So how effective are these exit polls on voter data? In India, how much does it reach people?
You mean the media? In terms of media coverage? Yes, I'm not going to discuss it here, but in the paper, what I can do is I can weigh each constituency by the level and amount of media coverage, and I can use that as ways to sort of, it doesn't really change much, but then it depends really on how exactly you want to weigh, what criteria you want to sort of use as a weight. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not that sensitive to sort of results of sort of media coverage. Because it's a constituency, and constituencies also have a lot of variation. So there's a lot of variation within constituency itself about media coverage. So when I actually aggregate it, it really doesn't. Okay, so just what kind of information do voters get due to exit polls? So this is just this is just a snapshot of what one of the national newspapers had printed after the first phase. The important thing to note is that these are exit poll figures for predicted number of seats that every alliance is expected to win. So there were two major alliances. That was the National Democratic Alliance led by the BJP and the Congress Plus, which is the Congress-led alliance. And everything else was bunched with others. So parties that did not participate in any of these pre-poll alliances, a lot of regional parties were considered as others. They gave information on each sort of media agency's predictions, but also averaged it out and gave information on predicted turnout. Okay, so like I said, they give a prediction on each alliance's performances by looking at the expected number of seats or predicted number of seats. And an alliance is a pre-election seat sharing arrangement between various parties, and that's going to be the unit of sort of the. I'm going to use that as substitute for party. Not to make my empirical analysis more tractable, but primarily because this is how the newspapers and the print media was giving information to voters at the alliance level and not at the disaggregated party level. They also gave prediction on voter turnout, and I think more importantly for the empirical analysis, they gave an indication of improvements from the last election. So, they would sort of highlight the fact that this particular alliance has made early poll gains, which is that they've gained more seats than they've had in the previous election. So it's above average, below average. And that's kind of going to be the notion of a surprise in a way. Okay, so just to map the model, if I don't actually get to finish it. So it's not really, it's just the structure that I'm going to use to sort of look at sort of the empirical results. So voters are uncertain about party quality, and quality can be any vectorial dimensions over which voters are uncertain about party characteristics. So they have a private signal. In the next phase, in phase 2, for example, voters receive exit polls, both about their own state, about how voters in their own state have voted, but also about how voters in other states have voted. And I'm going to call this a state signals and national signals and distinguish between the two. And then they're going to, based on these signals, they're going to reach an updated decision in a Bayesian manner. And then you can iterate this to T rounds of polling to see how sort of the variance of this sort of common pair evolves. I'm going to use two tests to try and see if the social learning holds. One is to use a within-state variation in polling using aggregate voter returns. I'm not going to talk about it because I won't have time, but it's a market structure model. It would be, and the idea is to just identify parameters that give sort of, identify the parameters and the belief updating. And then I'm going to use, I think identification is more robust here, I'm going to use individual voting responses and apply a regression discontinuity design to see whether or not late voters had reacted to these exit polls compared to, and improve their probability and decision making based on that. Okay, I'm not going to talk about results now, but I'll get to it in a while. Just finally, to try off the introduction, I think the setting is interesting, just to test certain aspects of observational learning, which is what I'm primarily interested in. Yeah.
So these late voters have voted, is it like about a week later than the other guys on the other side of the boundary?
Yes.
So I mean, as well as polls on the kind of,
A time effect. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, let me just. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. So one of the features that I think that's interesting to be able to test about observational learning in this setting is whether, although observational learning is not restricted to any sort of temporal or social or spatial proximity, one is interested to see whether these factors would accelerate the process of observational learning. Observational learning also excludes this idea that individuals would act based on conformity, so that's something that's confounding the analysis and that needs to be taken out. And finally, it's distinct from a saliency effect, which happens when, one is given information about a particular choice, but not, about a choice set, but not how each choice ranks within the set. And I think there are things in the setting that can be used to sort of, address each of these sort of points and issues. So to kind of look at whether or not social proximity or spatial proximity accelerates social learning, I'm going to try and distinguish between the effect of national exit poll results versus state exit poll results to see whether there's a differential effect. This is about the timing as well as about sort of the conformity effects. What I'm going to try and do is use a placebo where in some states, all voters had to vote for two elections, one for the state and one for the national, because these states choose to hold their state assembly elections at the same time as the national elections. And so I'm going to try and see whether, when they voted for the state elections, voters in these states responded to national exit poll results. And so if there was really a bandwagon or conformity effect, and voters chose to vote for the winners or the parties that are in the lead, you should also see some effect of that in state or assembly state voting election patterns. And that sort of also addresses this point about time effect. So if there is any sort of time trend, for example, it would also be picked up.